This video looks at Southeast Asia, Cold War, decolonization, and modern society. Basically, we want to understand the different forces that have created the economic systems that exist there today, as well as to basically understand, what led to the current political divisions. To begin, we got to reverse and go back a little bit in time to World War II. So keep in mind World War II. This was in the Pacific Ocean. The two major powers that were fighting against each other were the United States of America and the Empire of Japan. The Japanese goals for World War II were basically to acquire more territory, more land, as well as to gain access to more natural resources. So Japan has always been resource poor in terms of materials that you need for industrial production. Going into World War II, they had already seized Korea. They had already expanded into Manchuria and down along the eastern seacoast of China. They had taken a number of islands out here in Micronesia. And so what were they looking at? Well, they were looking at British and Dutch and French colonies in Indochina, South Asia, as well as in Indonesia. And so to this end, what they did is they created what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a region that is identified with this red boundary. So these were the main areas that they wanted to target, that they wanted to seize as new territory, although we do believe that they had the remainder of China as well as much of South Asia in their sights as well. The other major power was the United States of America, who had the support of Great Britain, the Dutch, and the French, although with the exception of the British, it would mostly be an American effort out in this part of the global conflict. And so it was through island hopping, their campaign of island hopping, that the United States of America broke down the defensive position of the Japanese and forced the Japanese into unconditional surrender by the summer of 1945. Now, following World War II, with the Japanese defeated and the United States of America basically occupying all of their former colonies in the Pacific Ocean, occupying some of their positions in South Korea, and with the Dutch and the French and the British regaining their colonies, the only two major rivalries in this part of the world were the Americans and the Soviet Union. So that competing system that existed in Europe also extended out here to the Pacific Rim as well. Now, in 1949, with the defeat of the Kuomintang, the nationalist forces, and their retreat back to the island of Formosa, another major competitor in this part of the world emerged, and that was the Chinese Communist government. So the United States of America, when they looked at this part of the world, what they saw were, really it was the United States of America versus the communist team of the Soviet Union and China. Really, when we take a look at it from the communist point of view, though, there were really three competing powers. There was the United States of America and the territories and the alliances that they held that cut through most of the Eastern Pacific. There was the Soviets and their sphere of influence that even included part of Northern Korea. And then down here in the southern portion, there was the Chinese government that was still a little bit too weak in the 1940s to really press their, influence other parts of the region, but they did have their sights set on, affairs in other countries. So the United States of America, though, being the only nuclear power at the time, being the only power with substantial naval forces and military forces and alliances in this part of the world, Really, it was the United States of America that kind of had the upper hand. So, the policy that directed the United States of America was one that was known as containment. This was a policy they were applying to the Soviet Union in Europe, and that they extended to Asia as well. And the idea of containment was to contain Soviet forces where they currently existed and not allow them to extend any further. And this directed American efforts throughout the Cold War in Asia, leading them to participate in two land wars and give support in civil wars throughout this area. So the first war to break out that the United States of America got involved in was that of Korea, which an earlier lecture video took a look at. And this war resulted from the Russian and Chinese-backed communist Northern Korean forces invading South Korea, and the United States of America and its UN allies beating back the northern invasion of South Korea and pushing all the way to the Yalu River before the Chinese got involved with land forces, at which point the conflict finally ended up at a stalemate right here at the 38th parallel. And this became known as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. It's where the fighting stopped, and it's where the fighting's pretty much been halted since the end of 1953. Now, Southeast Asia, similar events played out in Southeast Asia as well. There was a lot of intrigue in this part of the world between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, as well as between China and the United States of America, and between China and the Soviet Union. Keep in mind, China, the Soviet Union, they were both communist, but they did not necessarily practice the same type of communism, and Russia really wanted to be the dominant partner in that relationship, which led the Chinese to basically make a break from Russia by the 1970s. They basically said, okay, we're going to chart our own course, and they and the Soviets at times actually ended up getting involved in border skirmishes. So just because they had the same economic systems didn't mean that they were necessarily friends. So usually it was these three powers, these three camps, that whenever there was a civil war, whenever there was an outbreak of hostilities or whatever in this part of the world, that they would get involved. Now, this part of the world used to be a French colony. So the French first started to conquer what they called Indochina in the late 1800s. And their first main colony would be that of the future country of Vietnam, but from there they extended out, even into Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos. And in World War II, the Japanese invaded this part of the world and defeated the French forces there. Keep in mind, France was, one of the last of the continental Western European countries to fall to the Wehrmacht of the Nazi Germany. When France fell, its ability to basically support its armies abroad collapsed with it. So it was, pretty easy for the Japanese to go in there and defeat the French colonial government. What the Japanese did not expect, though, was resistance by the Vietnamese themselves. The Vietnamese did not necessarily like the French occupation of their country, and they had already started well before, even going back to World War I, working on the global scale for a political resolution to get their country back. And in World War II, when the Japanese invaded, what they viewed this as was just yet another foreign invasion of their territory. So they believed that with the collapse of the French government back in Europe during World War II, that they were basically, for all practical purposes, free. So when the Japanese came in behind them and conquered them and basically laid claim to their country, this guy right here, Ho Chi Minh, he was a communist leader, very popular leader among the Vietnamese people. He basically rallied opposition to the Japanese in an organization known as the Viet Minh. And they fought throughout World War II, against the Japanese. And following World War II, they believed that they would gain their independence because the United States of America, Great Britain, even France had been, calling for, an end to colonialism and imperialism, as part of their war aims. What happened though is after World War II, the French came back in with their military and they reasserted control over, their former colony. And so the Viet Minh, having just defeated the Japanese, having formed a, organized resistance, military resistance to them, basically turned their attention to the French. From 1945 to 1954, the United States of America gave some financial support to the French in Vietnam, but by 1954, it was very clear that the French would never, regain true control over the area, especially after the defeat of a major French garrison at Dien Bien Phu. The next stage in developments here came at the Paris Treaty, that was, or with the negotiations in Paris, that eventually resulted in what were known as the Geneva Accords. What the Geneva Accords were is that the French agreed with the Vietnamese that they needed to pull out of Vietnam. And bowing to some American pressure, the French negotiated a settlement whereby here at the 17th parallel, there would be a line drawn. To the north, this would basically be territory controlled by the government formed by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. So it'd be communist. And down here to the south, this would be, a government run by the Emperor of Vietnam that had been basically a French puppet, a guy by the name of Bao Dai. Of course, Bao Dai was unpopular, so he was quickly overthrown, following the Geneva Accords by another political leader. And he would only, and then the guy that overthrew Bao Dai would basically just be one in a series of guys that would rise to power and then eventually be overthrown. And so what you basically have in, with the Geneva Accords are two governments. You had the Democratic Republic of Vietnam here in the north. You had the Republic of Vietnam in the south. So the United States of America had agreed, with the Geneva Accords, and the Geneva Accords said, okay, at a certain point in time, after about like 10 years, there would be a vote. And the people would go and they would vote on who they wanted to basically reunite under. Would it be reuniting under the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and therefore becoming a communist country under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, or would they reunite under the capitalist government of the Republic of Vietnam? When the time came to vote, it was very clear that the Southern Vietnamese government was highly unpopular, especially among, the average Vietnamese people, and that if there was going to be a vote, that Ho Chi Minh would basically be the winner. So the Kennedy administration decided that they just simply weren't going to hold the vote, and if a vote were held, they weren't going to be bound by its results. This basically signaled to the North Vietnamese the renewal of hostilities, and so what would happen from this point on is that the North Vietnamese really had, different fighting forces that they would send south of the border to fight the South Vietnamese. You had the Viet Minh, you had the actual army of northern Vietnam, and then you also had another group, like a National Liberation Front, that was fighting down here in South Vietnam. And starting under the Kennedy administration, but really taking off after American naval forces were fired on in the Gulf of Tonkin. U.S. Congress basically gave to the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration a blank check to wage a war, a limited war, in the defense of South Vietnam. So from pretty much 1964 all the way up to 1973, this became a war pitting the United States and South Vietnam on one hand against the North Vietnamese, as well as the, a lot of Southern Vietnamese, farmers that supported the Viet Minh and took up arms against them. And eventually, it would lead to the downfall of the South Vietnamese government. So the National Liberation Front and what was derisively called the Viet Cong. So this is really the Viet Minh. That was their formal name, but the American GIs over there, they took to calling them the Viet Cong because it actually was an insult in Vietnamese to refer to them that way. They had free reign to invade down here into the southern portion of the country and to engage Allied forces there. The Vietnamese forces also made use of what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail here that could take them all the way throughout the country, through the backyards of Laos and Cambodia, that the United States of America couldn't stop because they didn't have congressional support or congressional permission to fight in those countries. Now, the United States of America, it seemed, had the upper hand. They had the more modern weapons. They were a bigger country. They had the South Vietnamese to support them. Starting very early in the conflict, for example, they began a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam known as Rolling Thunder that would later be intensified under Nixon. But the war, that started officially in 1964 became highly unpopular by 1968. This was largely due to a number of factors, one of which was what was called the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was this massive attack, surprise attack, taken on by the North Vietnamese at multiple strong points, ranging all the way from Hue here, all the way here in the north, all the way down to Saigon, the capital. And they actually breached the American embassy in the process. So, you have the Johnson administration that have been promising, as well as the military, they've been saying, hey, things are going great. We'll be winning this war in no time. Tet Offensive proves that's not going to happen. Second thing that happens is Rolling Thunder became very unpopular. During the course of the Vietnam War, we would basically end up dumping more bombs on North Vietnam alone than we dropped during the entirety of the European theater during World War II. And it actually led some of our UN allies to start accusing us of basically war crimes on the scale of the Germans during World War II. I mean, it was highly, highly controversial at an international level. So you had Rolling Thunder, you had Tet Offensive, but then there were some events that occurred, by American forces that really gave the United States of America a bad reputation in Vietnam. The first one was a massacre that occurred in March 1968, known as the My Lai Massacre. Basically, you had groups of U.S. GIs that were fighting in this area of Vietnam. It was an area very hostile to the United States and to the South Vietnamese forces. Very supportive of the Viet Minh. The American soldiers were out there constantly under attack. They couldn't tell, who was a civilian, who was a guerrilla, who was friend, who was foe. You had commanders that were very hard on their troops, especially one commander that was really tough on a lieutenant that was leading his men out there. And, of course, men were experiencing a bunch of casualties. So what happened was in March 1968, the lieutenant, everything broke down in terms of command of the troops and discipline and morale, and the troops went into the village of My Lai and just massacred everybody. News broke about this. The lieutenant was put on trial, but nothing really came of it. And this, in addition to Tet Offensive, really kind of sparked protests by the American people against the war effort. This was also on the back of, shortly thereafter, the publication of the Pentagon Papers that leaked what was known as the Phoenix program. in which the United States was undergoing, covert ops to go in and basically wage a campaign, a terror campaign against suspected, villages that were suspected of being sympathetic to the North Vietnamese. So you had all these incidents, and then to make matters worse, this war was being fought through conscription. So there was a draft in which people, American men, the 18 years and older, were basically being conscripted into the military and sent to Vietnam through a raffle system. But the thing is in the raffle system, if you had a friendly family doctor that was willing to say you had something like, bone spurs or some other illness that kept you from fighting, or if you were wealthy enough to be able to enroll in college and stay there, or if you had, a friend of the family with some, pull on the draft board, or that could smuggle you away to Canada, you could get out of the draft. And so what ended up happening is this war was fought disproportionately by the poor, especially communities of color that at home faced discrimination and segregation and civil rights violations, but then were told to go to Vietnam and fight for freedom. So all of these events by 1968 produced a massive counterculture revolution in the United States of America. Wide-scale protests. When the Nixon administration came in after the election in 1968, they attempted to continue the war. They, really ramped up bombing. They actually sent troops into Cambodia without congressional approval to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The end result was, going in the 1970s, it was proven that this was an unwinnable war. So in the end, the Nixon administration said that they were going to follow a process of Vietnamization in which they were turning over the direction of the war to the South Vietnamese and pulling American troops out. Basically, this was a way of getting out of Vietnam and basically just giving up the fight without, and trying to save face in the process. So this was done by 1973, and then 2 years later, Saigon fell, and this became all communist Vietnam, which it remains today. Now, that didn't end the bloodshed. Because of American bombing in Cambodia and Laos, those governments there were also destabilized. So Laos, had, civil unrest and conflict. Myanmar in this time period was under a brutal dictatorship. There was conflict occurring within Indonesia as well. Going into the 70s, especially in the 1980s, the Philippines, although they had gained independence from the United States of America, they fell under a dictatorship, the dictatorship of the Marcos regime by the 1980s. Now, here in Cambodia, this was kind of like the worst case scenario for social upheaval following, going into the 70s and the 80s. With the Cambodian government destabilized because of the American bombing, there was a communist leader that started a movement known as the Khmer Rouge, and the Khmer Rouge gained power by 1975. And their goal of communism was to create an agrarian society, a society of nothing but farmers. And so they literally depopulated all of their major cities, took people out of the cities, forced them to go to they were basically concentration camps where mothers and fathers were separated from their children. The children would go off to another part of the camp there. They would be, re-educated. The moms and the dads separated from each other. They would go to different parts of the camps where they would go, through indoctrination, forced to work. By the end of the Khmer Rouge, it's at least a good 2 million people died just from the brutality of that regime before it fell. So, 1970s were not good for, peace and, human happiness in this part of the world. But coming out of it, going into the 1980s and 1990s, things changed. Democratic societies started to form up in many of these countries that had been torn apart by war. You actually had, while Vietnam remained capitalist, I mean, even they started having to adopt elements of capitalism, just as China had to do going into the 1970s. And so today, if you go there, these are, today hotspots, economic hotspots of the world. These are some of the big economic centers, especially in the 1990s. Investors were pouring money into this part of the world. So one good example of this is Singapore. Singapore today is really a city-state that occupies a small island off the southern tip of Malaysia. Uh, and although it is Malaysian, as you can see up here from the ethnic composition, it represents the ethnic diversity of Southeast Asia. So, most of the people living in Singapore are Chinese, immigrants to their area, followed by Malays, but you also have Indians, and then you have other people on top of that. And Singapore is a hotspot of international finance and banking. Just a lot of money pours through Singapore. And it sits right here on the Strait of Malacca, which sees, the vast majority of world trade. I'm talking about cargo ships and just stuff that pours through the Strait of Malacca on its way to and from production centers and markets. Now today, there are still some issues that they got to face, just as with the rest of the Pacific Ocean. A lot of these countries have large population centers that live right there on the coastline. So global warming is a big concern to them. There's the anticipation of losing entire cities if ocean levels continue to rise. Of course, it is also a highly populated area, not a lot of land mass for these dense populations to live in. So, feeding people is a challenge, as is pollution from that many people living there. Still a very volcanic part of the world, so typhoons, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions present challenges. And of course, development. So even though these are some economic hotspots of the world, that does not mean that development is even, so they still have to wrestle with a lot of poverty. But again, what we're seeing in places like Singapore, for example, are the development of modern, bustling cities that are making gains to wrestle with these issues and provide their people with education and happiness and jobs and a healthy place to live.